as our next speaker and our luncheon keynote speaker, Admiral Bill Gortney. Those who know Admiral Gortney know that if you look at a career and you could say, what are the meaningful warfighter billets, he served in them all. Whether it was in the Gulf War, as the advisor, as the naval liaison to the Air Force component commander, going into Iraq, strike group commander in the Gulf, and Fifth Fleet commander before he went over to U.S. Fleet Forces. Bill Gortney has done it all. In the middle of all of that, he was allowed some R&R as the director of the Joint Staff, which he found a spa-like experience and very refreshing. And he's only just recently been sent out to be the combatant commander at Northern Command. Let's give a big welcome to Bill Gortney.
Yeah, spa-like experience. It's not exactly how I remembered it, Pete. Last time, a couple years ago, I spoke at this event and told people that being the director of the Joint Staff was kind of the Chang of the Joint Staff, kind of make the ship move it through the water, and then when a CHT line broke, my phone rang. But thanks for inviting me to be here today. It's a great honor and opportunity to join you, and a special thanks to my longtime shipmate Pete Daly in his role of setting this up. This is probably one of the best attended events, and quite frankly, give yourself an applause to support it. It's a little humbling to be the luncheon keynote speaker at such a prestigious event. My mother would be either very proud or shocked, and I put money on shocked. I'm going to attempt to keep you awake with some prepared remarks, and then turn the forum over to you for your questions, and that I will give my best to endeavor to answer. There'll be a coin for the first question, so that should motivate for some of you. But before I get started, I commend you for hosting this event in San Diego in February. I know I'm not the only speaker who made the arduous trip from the cold, and we know that those who came from the Beltway in order to be here are doubly ecstatic by being here. Throughout the event, you have the opportunity to hear from an impressive group, a collection of speakers, active duty retired flags, Bob Workaday, and general officers, and civilians and other leaders of the sea services. Really a great opportunity. Now I'm going to take you back in time and talk to you what we thought the future would be like in the past. And then I'm going to cover how that future really turned out by discussing our current strategic environment. And I'm going to close with what I believe are a few of the challenges looking to today's future. Back in 2012, I was the director of the Chang on the Joint Staff and came here and spoke at AFCEA. And my talk back then, 2012, covered three topic areas. The first was the strategic landscape, the second was the fiscal landscape, and the third was our defense strategic review. Now, remarking on the strategic landscape, there were three things that readily came to mind. The first was the duration and impact of the then new Arab Spring, the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Iraq and the drawdown of the surge forces in Afghanistan, and in the middle of these changes in the Middle East, renewed interest in the Asia-Pacific region. Additionally, the strategic landscape, I focused on four main threats to the U.S. This was back in 2012. First was nuclear proliferation, extremism. The third was cyber attacks. And the fourth was rising powers. The second topic area was the fiscal landscape, with the potential for sequestration in 2013, a fiscal threat so draconian that most at the time thought our legislators would never let it happen. The third topic area was the Defense Strategic Review, which encompassed four guiding principles. The first, maintain the world's finest military, sustain U.S. global dominance. The second, do not hollow out the force. The third, everything was on the table, no sacred cows. And the fourth was to preserve the quality of the all-volunteer force and do not break the faith with the all-volunteer force. Now, last April, 2 years after speaking here, I spoke at the Sea Air Space Symposium in D.C. Many of you were attending that too. Some of you need a hobby. But there I mentioned General Dempsey's threat model of 2, 2, 2, and 1. 2, China and Russia. The second 2 is Iran and North Korea. The third 2 was Al-Qaeda and transnational networks, and the 1 was cyber. And in my talk, I expanded the chairman's model to 2, 2, 1, and X. The X being the unknown, because the rest of the world gets a vote on what we think the future is going to look like. Now, what has happened over those 3 short years? What did we predict right, and what did we not get so right? Well, I'll tell you, I love being right because I was right about the added X, the unknown caused by the world getting a vote. Arab Spring is the longest spring I've ever seen. Combining its effects in Syria with the withdrawal of forces from Iraq has resulted in the significant negative unintended consequence of ISIL. The Taliban are regrouping in Afghanistan, and the full impact of our reduction there has yet to be seen. As is Iran's intent to take advantage of the crisis caused by the Arab Spring to expand its influence in the region, concurrently bringing ambiguity to the nuclear question. Now, how about the rest of the world? North Korea had a leadership change that makes me think longingly for the predictable nature of the current leader's father. The son keeps both Harry Harris and I up at night, Harry to be prepared to fight tonight on the peninsula, and me to defend the homeland from ballistic missile attack. We're trying to bring China peacefully into a great power status, an effort we have never done successfully, by the way. Doesn't mean that we're not going to get it right this time. We just need to be aware of our past track record. And China is using diplomatic and economic means to deny the United States physical and political access around the world. I was just in the Bahamas, took Sherry there for 17 hours. I'm a romantic fool. And I was stunned with the amount of money they were investing in our neighbors just 40 miles from our shore. They're expanding their militarily both quantitatively and qualitatively at an astounding rate, again to deny us physical and political access in the Western Pacific. Furthermore, threats to the U.S. space services are increased as they pursue disruptive and destructive countermeasures capabilities such as anti-satellite and jamming technologies. They are developing capability to hold at risk the only U.S. military capability not held at risk today, and that's the Navy and the carrier strike groups of the United States Navy. Our ability to capitalize on maneuver in the maritime in order to project power, open and hold battle space together with our joint partners, and allow access to the full joint force, well, it causes them concern. Additionally, their territorial claims and actions to back up those claims continue to cause our neighbors and our allies great angst. The potential here for miscalculation is very high, particularly in the South China Sea. And this is why exercising with their Navy is so important. We learn from them, and we reduce the probability of them believing their own press and think they can succeed militarily in a crisis. Visible and open exercises allow potential opponents around the world to see our capability and say to themselves, today is not the day to challenge the United States military. The actions of Russia have caught us off guard. Although having negative demographic trends, they are developing a qualitatively better military than the quantitative military of the Soviet Union. New doctrine to employ this new military is being employed in the Ukraine. Now, I'm not ready to declare a new Cold War, as their long-term ambitions, well, they're ambiguous. That said, 2 thoughts come to mind when debating the efficacy of a new Cold War. The first is, what we believe is interesting, but what the Russians believe is what really matters. And the second, between the fall of the Soviet Union and the election of Putin as prime minister, was only 8 years. And that's just a blink of the eye in the world's history of the many wars between nation states. Transnational criminal networks continue to exploit the many seams between our geographic combatant commanders, our interagency partners, and the seams within our neighbors in our part of the world. Through these seams, now think about it, through these seams move drugs, money, people, and weapons. And through those same seams, enemies of our nation will maneuver to attack our nation. The emergence of homegrown violent extremists add to my anxiety, spurred on by a very sophisticated social media campaign by AQ and ISIL, trying to generate many of our own citizens to cause harm against their fellow citizens. And finally, cyber. We've seen attacks against government and private networks with increased frequency and visibility. We as a nation are conflicted as to how we should handle this threat, and it is my hope that it does not take a cyber 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor to force us to finally find the solution. Okay, with those cheerful thoughts, let's turn to money. Historically, there's a 27 to 32% reduction in the DoD budget when coming out of major wars, and this goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And we're about 10 to 12% into that historical reduction, assisted by the improbable sequestration becoming a reality, accounting for $42.7 billion reduction. Now, I'm not here to debate the historical reduction of the DoD budget. It's a fact of life, and we need to deal with it. The problem today is this. Coming out of major wars, we have always entered a more secure international security environment than when we went to war. And that's why you go to war. This time, however, as I've previously discussed, the international security environment is clearly not better than when we started. Now, I'm not here to blame anyone for today's security environment, but to highlight our inability to correctly predict the future. What matters is we clearly did not predict today's events even 3 short years ago. The world voted differently than what we predicted, and the rapidity of those changes, quite frankly, are startling. And I'm confident we'll repeat this skill set again. This is why I cannot fathom why anyone would want to work in the intelligence or weather professions. Both never predict the future correctly. That's for you, Twig. Today's security environment is complicated by crises around the world. Combine these crises with the ambiguity of the future, and today's fiscal reality results in risk. Risk incurred by not funding sufficiently to maintain our military at a level that will ensure the appropriate strategy is successful. But I dislike the word risk. We throw the word around so much, it's quite frankly meaningless to just about everyone. First, the single word risk is not descriptive, possessive, or impactful. We need to better articulate what risk means, identify who owns risk, and explain how risk impacts our ability to execute our strategy. From my perspective, there are 3 types of risk. First, risk to mission. Second, risk to the force executing the mission. And third, risk to the long-term health of the force. The first, risk to mission, really ask yourself a question. Are we able to execute the mission or missions that we are assigned? The second, risk to force executing the mission, ask this question. Are the forces who execute the assigned mission able to do so with acceptable losses? And the third, risk to the long-term health of the force. While doing the first and the second today, are we ensuring we do not hollow or break the future force so that the future force is able to execute the future missions with acceptable losses? Now let's talk about who owns risk. And to be honest, I look at risk through the eyes of commanders. When mission and lives are at stake, only commanders can and will be held accountable. Therefore, you're going to be pretty surprised on how few Social Security numbers are involved, and I'll only read the last 4 to you. Okay? The first, risk to mission. It's owned by the combatant commanders, the service components, the Secretary of Defense, and our President. That's not that many people. These same own the second, risk to force executing the mission, but here we add the 5 service chiefs. Chief of Naval Operations, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard. These 5 are responsible for the readiness and effectiveness of their services. The third, risk to the long-term health of the force, it's owned by those service chiefs themselves, for they are accountable to build their future services. It bothers me when I hear someone, other than those few whom I mentioned, say, oh, we can assume the risk. Only those few Social Security numbers can make that critical determination. Now, some might agree with my assessment of ownership as not being inclusive enough. Clearly, Congress plays an absolutely critical role here, but they are not commanders, and again, I look at risk through the eyes of a commander. And this is why I believe command is so important, and it starts at an early age. The most important selection boards our Navy holds every year are the individual community command screen boards. From these, we pick our future COCOMs, Chief of Naval Operations, chairmen, and senior commanders. The commands they will lead and experiences they will gain from the decisions they must make as commanders will shape and inform the decisions in the future, and it's our future. And I love commanders. They're the heart and soul of our fleet. Forgive me for living in the tactical. Let me get back to the strategic. Now, history shows the impact of getting the first two types of risk wrong. Commanders and service chiefs have been relieved, as have secretaries of defense, and presidents have not been reelected. But what about the third, risk to the long-term health of the force? Again, history shows when we misjudged the first two and failed, most often it was because we failed to ensure the third in the years preceding the event. And this is why I believe the third risk is the most important. How well today's commanders succeed in dealing with today's missions is really a function of yesterday's decisions. And how well tomorrow's commanders succeed in dealing with tomorrow's mission will be a function of decisions we must make today. The challenge is today's security environment, composed of multiple crises around the world. COCOMs, the combatant commanders, must confront the crises they are having immediately. Crisis caused by bullies who only understand the threat of force. And this means forward deployed and forward-based forces. The COCOMs, well, they don't really want forces on a prepare to deploy order who's going to be there in 90 days. Service chiefs must balance their ability to meet this demand while ensuring their relief and their release relief will have the capability and capacity to succeed in the future. And this is where inadequate resourcing to meet the strategy increases those three types of risk. We need to better explain this increase, how it manifests itself, and what we need in order to mitigate those increased risks. Now, I believe the cascading effects of accumulated readiness reductions over time increase the three types of risk. The three types of risk are not binary. It's not as simple as you either have risk or you do not. And the three types of risk are not static, having the same amount of risk over time, nor does risk increase in a linear fashion. Instead, accumulated readiness reductions over time results in compounding risks. The three types of risks exponentially increase over time. The force does not get hollow with a flick of a switch, say a single sequestration cut, but through inadequate resourcing over multiple years, combined with a force stressed from 13 years of war and which is dealing with today's security environment of simultaneous crises around the world. Failing to mitigate the risk of the long-term health of the force today is a recipe for mission failure with unacceptable losses in the future. Which brings me to the Defense Strategic Review and its four guiding principles I mentioned earlier. Maintain the world's finest military and sustain U.S. global dominance. Do not hollow out the force. Everything is on the table, no sacred cows, and preserve the quality of the all-volunteer force. Do not break faith with the all-volunteer force. In order to do the first three, the services must be sized correctly for the projected missions, with the proper readiness levels, since investments in today's readiness are investments in tomorrow's readiness. With the required modernization improvements, ensuring today's forces are credible until the end of their expected service life. With the required recapitalization of the current force with new capability. Now, as the commander of NORAD and Northern Command, if the services are able to do what I just mentioned, we're going to be okay in defending the homelands and respond to the American people, because we execute our mission through current and future readiness. The services must also recognize and have the ability to discard unneeded or obsolete capability while eliminating waste and how the services build and maintain the force. We must be good stewards of the American taxpayers' dollars while being the guardians and protectors of those American taxpayers. The fourth cannot be overstated. The resiliency of the all-volunteer force has been tested over 13 years of war, and the value of the all-volunteer force has been proven. In that 13 years, less than 1% of America raised their right hand and swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, if you're part of that 1% that joined after 9/11, please stand and be recognized and thanked for your service. Come on, get on up. Bring them up. All right, you can sit down. Now, we must also thank your families for standing by you. We who wear the cloth of our nation know it as our families who are the very stitches that hold that cloth together. We must also thank the American people who have stood by our sides over the last 13 years. Where some might have questioned why we were in those wars, no one questioned and all supported the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen who raised their right hand. Now, in the future, we in uniform must never take that support for granted, for we need that support even more in the future when dealing with the many crises and potential for major war. Finally, America must never stop supporting our wounded warriors and the families of the fallen from all of our wars. While we as a nation debate how much we want to invest in our defense, we as a nation must remember that only 1% of our nation volunteered to serve our nation in a time of war. And it is my hope that the 99% who could not or did not volunteer make the correct decision to fund the 1% to the proper levels required to continue to protect our great nation. Finally, while the DoD budget is reducing, one thing is certain: it will go back up again. We just don't know when. Our budget is cyclic, and the reason for an increase is usually never good for our nation, for we find the necessity to go to war. Some trigger event, a crisis which we are unable to control, puts us there. Today, far too many of us are looking at our shoes while surfing the backside of this budget decline. And during the budgetary decline, we must maintain the capacity and capability to prevent a crisis from escalating to war. So we must also look horizontally across the budget cycle, because if that crisis turns into a major war, we must have the industrial base and intellectual industrial base that will allow us to rapidly build capability and capacity to prevail in war. And this is why I believe in the necessity of maintaining our current industrial base. In war, the three secrets of our successes are: the first, and you look around here, we attract the very best of the youth of America. The second, we combine the very best with the very best of American industry and technology. And the third, this is the secret sauce, we then give the very best training. Our industrial base and intellectual industrial base breed competition, which results in greater innovation and the best capability American industry can deliver. And only through competition do we strike the right balance between industry's requirement for profit to their shareholders and delivering the best capability at the best value for the American taxpayer. Today, we've given a shout out to those who wear the cloth of our nation. And I'd like, at this time, give a shout out to those that equip those in uniform, American industry. Please stand up so that those of us that are wearing the cloth give you the round of applause you so richly deserve. Come on, come on. If you're industry, get up. Stretch your legs. Today, I've taken you back in time. We talked about our success in predicting the future by discussing the current security environment and how quickly it can change. We then talked to risk incurred by not funding sufficiently to maintain our military at a level that will ensure the appropriate strategy is successful. From there, well, we discussed three types of risk and how they compound exponentially, which leads to a hollow force, and this hollow force not only fails to deliver on the strategy, but also is a recipe for mission failure with unacceptable losses in the future. And finally, we discussed what we must do to mitigate these risks in order for today's and tomorrow's commanders to succeed when confronted with a crisis we did not predict. Thanks for making it to the end. I've talked far too long. Let's hear your questions.
Thank you, sir. The first question, and if you want to give him a coin, this came from Mr. Everett Hayes.
Where's that coming from?
Considering the current situation with
Okay.
ISIS, is the shift to the Pacific taking a back seat, or are we still all systems go?
Well, I think we need to understand what the shift to the Pacific is. I think what's important about our refocus on the Pacific is not necessarily the physical, it's the intellectual shift in Washington, D.C. I mean, in Washington, D.C., our leadership has been appropriately focused on 13 years of war, fighting the wars we're in. But we don't have much bandwidth. Leadership only has so much bandwidth. And so I think the fact that intellectually we are now moving to the Pacific is what's important. Our Navy's never stopped shifting to the Pacific. We've been working for a 60-40 since you were working in the 3-5, Pete. And so we've never stopped focusing on the Pacific. To be honest, I've been fairly critical of some of my Navy shipmates that I didn't think were focused on the wars we were fighting. So for us, it's really not much of a difference. But the big thing, I think, for DOD is that intellectual shift within Washington, D.C. Next question, whoever you are.
Thank you, sir. Next question. How critical is the nuclear deterrence mission in the future? And do you feel our aging infrastructure and cyber risks to our nuclear command, control, and communication are a problem?
As long as other nations have the ability to existential threat to eliminate our nation, we need a nuclear deterrent. And what's challenging for us right now is the most survivable is our SSBN force, and we have to recapitalize that force, which about every, Mike Connors, are you here? About what, every 30 years is a corporate bill, whether it's ICBMs, bombers, or SSBNs, it becomes a corporate bill. And we're having that debate inside our country right now. But we have to deliver on that particular capability. As far as the command and control to do that, well, to be honest, we took our eye off the ball. Okay? We took our eye off the ball. I don't know why we did or where we were looking, probably at the wars. And so we're shoring that back up. And Secretary Carter was just voted out of committee this morning. And I know when he was the DepSecDef, he formed up an organization that I'm a voting member of now to make sure we're there. And so we got the right roadmap in, putting that system of systems in place. We have it. It's secure today. It's a little fragile, as are most things, and we're shoring that thing back up. So we'll be okay. Next question.
Next question. How prepared are we on our homeland to combat terrorism, and what impact will the military play in their defense support to civil authorities' role?
Okay. I think, as I mentioned in my speech, the primary threat right now is the homegrown violent extremist, motivated either by AQ or ISIL or just a disgruntled citizen. That's the greatest threat to us at this particular point. We're supporting to law enforcement in that role at Northern Command and NORAD, and we have a pretty good system in place, but it's not perfect. I don't know a single perfect system that happens to be out there. As far as defense support for civil authorities, many people think defense support for civil authorities is all about weather of mass destruction events. But the task that I have in Northern Command for defense support and civil authorities, quite frankly, covers most of my mission sets from defense of the homelands as well as those weathers of mass destruction are out there. And we're responsible to help the lead federal agency in that regard sweep up that broken glass. We're not in charge unless it's a really bad day. We're there to assist in a supporting relationship to the lead federal agency, most likely Homeland Security. Next question.
You have two significant commands that you lead, including defending our homeland and protecting our airspace. How do you prioritize their needs in an era of limited fiscal resources?
Who are these people that are asking these questions? Jeez Louise. You know, I've been working for Northern Command since I was a one-star select, when I was the 2, 3, and 5 at Fleet Forces Command. And one-star select in our Navy is what we call captains. And I was been the director, and then I was just the naval component to Chuck Jacoby, because we finally codified activity the way we've been acting since 2004. So I know Northern Command and NORAD pretty well, better than most, coming into the command. And there's two schools of thought. The first is, if you're inside the headquarters, they say, hey, you've got all this responsibility and authorities and you don't have any forces. And if you're outside the headquarters, the first thing that people say is, hey, Northern Command just wants forces. They just want stuff. And I'm here to tell you, I've been to all the service chiefs and all of the force providers, and I'm not looking for forces. And getting the command to focus on what is our mission functions and tasks, where does those missions come from, what are the authorities, and then where do we get the forces to do it, and where does the money come from to do that? It's pretty startling. The services do it out of hide. It's service-retained capability that they give to us, either in their own training or in the case of defense of the homeland in the maritime. We're going to use forces that are in the basic or advanced phase of the FRTP, of their FRTP, in order to execute the missions, or if they're on the backside in surge. So the services are very, very supportive of Northern Command and NORAD. I muster, on a morning muster report, I think about 3,500 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guard, total, about 3,500 a morning. And most of that is the Air Force and the Air National Guard doing the Noble Eagle mission for us and defending the National Capital Region. So we're in pretty good shape. And that's why when I get asked by people the effects of the budget or sequestration, I said if you just make sure the services do what are funded to do the mission, as I talked about in my speech, then we're going to be okay, because we execute through current and future readiness. If it's a really bad day, the services will be all over us. They'll give us all of the forces that we need. Quite frankly, what I'm going after is to make sure I have a phase 0 command and control structure, and that's the same one that we're going to execute up through phase 3. You know, if you get two things right, command and control and commander's intent, all things will work out well, and that's what we're trying to put in place, is that C2 structure. But the forces will be there when we need them. I have high confidence the services. I mean, we throw, like Superstorm Sandy, you know, we threw, Navy and Marine Corps threw capability, and no one was asking for it. We just go. You know, it's the sound of the gun. We're going to go. The American people are in need. We're going to rush there. I got to make sure that the C2's there up front.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
It's the same guy asking the questions. Oh, okay. I thought he was just an overachiever. All right. All right.
Reflecting on your keeping awake issues at Fleet Forces Command,
Yeah.
how have those issues changed in your current role?
Not at all. I mean, you know, the thing that keeps me up is my miniature schnauzer, Jack, 12 years old. He's blind and diabetic, and that's what keeps me up at night. Next question, please.
What is the right mix between the high-end and low-end platforms in fleet structure and operations?
Boy, someone is out there has been reading my notes. All right, this has nothing to do with Northcom and NORAD, but I'll go ahead and answer the question. You know, I'm a history major. My father bought my degree. I'm only emotional about the Naval Academy on Army-Navy Day, right? And but our Navy has always been had a high-low mix. We've never been able to afford what we want, which is high, 100% high. We've always had a high-low mix, and that's in our fleet, and that's been on our flight decks of our aircraft carriers. The question is, what's the right balance of high and low? And as you look at that, there's a certainty in life. High capability can do low capability, but low will never do high. So striking that right balance is what's really important. I'm going to give you an example. And this was back on the Nimitz Strike Group deployment twig. When was that? That was, what's that? 15, right? No, not with you, but we delayed Nimitz going on deployment because she had a reactor cooling pump problem. Now, I don't know why that's an issue. It's just boiling water. But so we had to delay her for 2 months, but we pushed the Crudez on deployment on time. And they went to support Afghanistan, the fight in Afghanistan, held Fozzie out there and support in Afghanistan. 30% of the close air support every day comes from a flight deck of an American aircraft carrier. And then the Syrian chemical raised its head. Serious chemical disposal, what to do with it. He was going to use, or had used, chemical weapons. And Nimitz was on the way home. The whole strike group was on the way home. And we turned her around and pushed her back up into the Red Sea. We even put Nimitz into the Eastern Med, and Nimitz hadn't been in the Med since I was a lieutenant on her. Okay? Now the problem is that we didn't know how long that crisis was going to be, and it was a full-up crisis. We needed TLAM, and we needed TAC air. We needed the air wing to open and hold that battle space and go into that IADS. And we didn't know how long this crisis was going to be until the guy blinked, until the bully blinked. And it's only through credible threat that bullies blink. And now I have to, these CRUDES, the TLAM shooters, or cruisers and destroyers, are, I got to get them home because they're going on a 10.5, 11-month deployment now. All right? So now how are we going to backfill them? That was a question. That, and I needed a new air defense commander for Nimitz as well. And we didn't have one because of sequestration. We didn't have one trained up, ready to go. We didn't have a strike group ready to go because we deferred that strike group from sequestration. And so, but at that same time at Fleet Forces, I was deploying 3 FIG-7s, great ships, but they weren't what I needed. They didn't have the capability, the power projection capability of our CRUDES. And so that was really an eye-opener for me, understanding that we have to get this percentage right of that high-low mix. I've got plenty of mission. We have more mission than stuff in the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. And we have to cover a lot of bases. And it was great that we could push those frigates down to John Kelly at Southern Command. But at the end of the day, we really needed TLAM shooters out there in the Red Sea and Eastern Med. One more question, and then he's going to stand up. Give me a book I can't afford.
Sir, the final question is, given your reticence on predicting the future, what do you see as the greatest threat facing the military in the next 5 years?
I think it's the function of my speech. And I'm glad that was the last question because, you know, there is a test after this speech. It's on your iPad. How do we, the budget's going to come down. It is a fact of life. How do we maintain current and future readiness? How do we modernize? How do we recapitalize? How do we take a breath to be ready for the next time we go to war while dealing with the crises? That's our challenge. And we've got to just figure up, giddy up. And no one's going to do this thinking for us. We have to figure out how we're going to do it and still get the mission done for those COCOMs who own those first 2 types of risk. Thanks for coming today. Thanks for supporting that, AFCEA and our Naval Institute.
Admiral Gortney, on behalf of the United States Naval Institute and AFCEA, I'd like to present you a book, Fire on the Water. It was printed by the United States Naval Institute Press with an AFCEA bookmark. I'll tell you, it was really refreshing to have someone stand up here in the position that you're in and to talk with the candor that you talk, provide the realism and the practicality rather than have some people that you often hear on TV, the spin meisters, and someone who can give you and throw you nothing but fastballs. If you can't hit them, I feel sorry for you.
Thank you very much, General. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.